Hello everyone, this is Ud. Today let's talk about how to develop risk control measures. In ISO 45001, the Occupational Health and Safety Management System requires organizations to establish, implement, and maintain a process for the elimination of hazards and the reduction of OHS risks using the following hierarchy of controls. First, try to eliminate the hazard. If elimination isn't possible, the next step is to substitute it with less hazardous processes, operations, materials, or equipment. And if substitution isn't still isn't feasible, then we move to engineering controls or reorganizing the work to reduce exposure. And after that, we apply administrative controls such as training. And finally, as a last line of defense, we use adequate personal protective equipment or PPE. These five approaches correspond to this inverted triangle we're all familiar with, the hierarchy of controls. And in this triangle, the higher a measure is in the triangle, the more effective it is. So that's why we always prioritize the controls at the top. First, we ask whether the risk can be completely eliminated. However, this is really possible because wherever there's a production or operational activity, there will always be some level of risk. And if elimination isn't feasible, then the next step is substitution. So it's basically replacing the hazard with safer processes, operations, materials, or equipment. So for example, automation technologies such as robots can replace manual tasks and significantly reduce safety risks. So this is a process substitution. It's also operation substitution. And material substitution is another example, like using water-based paint instead of solvent-based paint. Not only benefits the environment, but also reduce the risk of fire or explosion. And equipment substitution is also common. For example, manufacturers now use AGV carts instead of forklifts to transport materials, which is generally safer. And after substitution, we move on to engineering controls. So these measures physically isolate or separate people from hazards through equipment or devices. So for example, like those machine guards, interlocks, light curtains, or explosion-proof electrical components, and like guardrails for walking at heights. All of these are engineering control measures. And next come administrative controls, which focus on managing or regulating human behavior. That include standard operating procedures, employee training, and safety signages. So all of these measures are intended to ensure that people follow safety rules. And finally, we have PPE, which is essentially the last line of defense to protect employees, and is only considered after all other measures have been implemented. And among the five levels of controls, elimination and substitution are the most effective. But in reality, most risks are difficult to complete eliminate or substitute. So therefore, in practice, engineering controls are usually the primary risk control measures, followed by administrative controls, with PPE serve as the final layer of protection. In many regulations and standards related to risk control, I've noticed that companies are also asked to develop control measures from different perspectives. For example, this Jiangsu Province regulation on work safety reporting requires companies to establish control measures from 4 aspects: organization, technology, administration, and emergency response. So, to be honest, I found the term organization is a bit vague. It's not very clear what it is, what it actually refers to. And technology probably corresponds to engineering controls, and administration would be administrative controls. And of course, they also require emergency response control measures. And another Jiangsu local standard takes a slightly different approach. It requires companies to develop risk control measures from perspectives of engineering technology, administration, training and education, personal protective equipment, and emergency response. So I'm a little confused because both documents come from Jiangsu province. So I do feel there should be more consistency in the terminology. And now let's look at the Shanghai. The Shanghai Risk Control Guideline requires companies to establish control measures in 4 areas: engineering controls, safety management, personal protective equipment, and emergency response. So this framework is more standardized. Like the engineering control, safety management, personal protective equipment align quite well with ISO 45001. And one noticeable difference between ISO 45000 and these Chinese regulations is that Chinese regulations typically require emergency response measures to be included as part of the risk control measures. Personally, I feel this can be somewhat repetitive because we already have like emergency response plans in place for some risks. So why do we need to repeat them here? And also, I think the regulations should clearly emphasize the priority of control measures. Engineering controls should be considered first because they are generally the most effective. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.